I first went to Palenque when I was a kid, of course. I think I was on the same trip.
You were 3.
3 years old. And I have to say that today still, just walking around that site, it's a magical experience. There's really no other place like it, because when you walk, say, through the palace, Pacal's palace, it's still there. I mean, it's not even really a ruin. The paintings are still on the walls.
The whole story of Maya archaeology and Mesoamerican archaeology, indeed American archaeology, almost took place there in a lot of senses. The explorations started as early as the middle of the 18th century.
It's just an incredible place to be, and it'll always have that aura about it, I hope.
Hello there, it's good to be back. Had to think of a title, and I came up with this one based on the title of a Star Trek episode in 1967. Seemed appropriate. As you can see from this wonderful photograph, the site itself of Palenque sits on a kind of a shelf on the mountains facing the Tabasco coastal plain. And so topographically, it is a city on the edge. In its inscriptions, they cover, many millenniums of time with the master calendar inscriptions that the Maya are so, noted for. So that in a sense, with this system that literally tamed eternity, they wove mythical and real history into sort of a thing, so that I thought this title would just be appropriate. The place sits in Chiapas, down here in the Maya area, and there's Palenque right there. You can see the western location of it within the Maya. The Maya area is this huge thing here it's still about half the size of Texas, I reckon. And all the great sites, particularly down in here and up in Yucatan, Quintana Roo, and Campeche. You can see it here and how sort of isolated it is. It's very close to a colonial town, Santo Domingo de Palenque, that was established by the Spanish in the 1570s. This is an area that was on the frontier between the New Spain, the Mexican part, and the Audiencia of Guatemala. And this was just sitting in the woods here. Nobody knew about it until the 1750s or so. Nobody in the modern times, that is. In a sense, sometimes I get irritated by the term lost city, because a lost city that is found is usually something defined as found by a white male European looking around in the woods in the New World or the Americas. But this really was a lost city after it was abandoned, and not many people knew about it. There you can see the principal buildings. You can also know that, like most Maya sites that have been well known and partially cleared or even excavated, you're looking at about 5 or 6% of the site. It's all through the woods here. It's about 16 square kilometers of ruin, 37 or 100 or 4,000 structures. Just an incredible thing. It was just only mapped a few years ago. And there's buildings in there that are bigger than these that have never been even visited by people. So there's the so-called palace, which probably was. It was probably a setting for the royal court, particularly during the 7th century. David's going to talk about that a lot. And but you can see the complicated architecture and the unique tower that's here at Palenque. We're here looking out. You can see that vast Tabasco coastal plain in the background. The Temple of the Inscriptions that we'll hear a lot about tonight. One of the largest so-called pyramids. I say so-called because a real pyramid just has a pointed top and sides and no stepped zones. The so-called pyramids of Mesoamerica and Palenque are, of course, merely stepped platforms to hold a building on top. And we know now that if they have 9 zones, that they are likely to be associated with the underworld and therefore standing as a funerary monument. But nobody knew this a long time ago. Another group, the so-called cross group. This is a wonderful setting here. This is Allen Ginsberg, the poet, visited here back in the 1940s, 50s, and called this the broken chapels in the green basement of a mount. And these are the 3 temples. But it didn't always look like that. Back in the 1750s, a rumor started going around in the frontiers of New Spain that there were casas de piedra out in the woods. Nobody had seen them, except for maybe 2 or 3 people who had visited Palenque town. And so people started going in there. And rumors reached what's now Guatemala City, and the Captain General of Guatemala decided he would find out a little bit more about this. So he sent the deputy mayor of Santo Domingo de Palenque into the forest to make some drawings. It was a trail that went to what we know now as the palace. And they went in there, Jose Calderon, one of the folks in Palenque, with a little piece of paper. He'd never drawn anything in his life. He was terrible at drawing, but he had to send this, and he knew this would be sent to the king of Spain. So he found this temple, and he came upon this great slab. We know now that unlike most Maya sites that have upright monuments out in isolated plazas and things, that Palenque instead, given the great limestone sources they had, put big slabs on the walls of the temples, and this helped to preserve the inscriptions and the sculptures. Anyway, Jose Calderon saw this thing in the summer of 1785. That's how long it took people to figure out to go in there. And he drew this. I can sympathize with this. This is sort of what I did when I first went to Yucatan. J. Eric Thompson, the great Maya authority, died in the 70s. Sir Eric looked over my shoulder one time when I first got to Yucatan. I was making a drawing of a stela at Zibalchaltun. And he whispered aside to Dr. Andrews, who was my employer, "That's the worst drawing of a Maya monument I've ever seen." And that was sort of the source of my education. I started in and looking at the drawing now, which I still have. He was absolutely right. Anyway, this is what Calderon drew. He sent it back to Estavacheria in Guatemala City, and that so irritated the Captain General of Guatemala that he sent another person to Palenque, this time the royal architect, who drew this picture of one of the Maya pyramids in 1786 with the little lollipop trees all over it. And but you can see the bas-reliefs on the piers between the doorways and trees growing up and all sorts of things. And he did a pretty good description. He even did architectural cross-sections of some of the buildings showing the corbelled arch vaults in there. In 1787, Antonio del Rio, an artillery captain, May the 5th, walked into Palenque with a group of about 30 people with hatchets. They cleared the area, and they dug in all the buildings. They dug beneath the floors in some, and took away a lot of stones. And these stones and sculptures, bas-reliefs, all ended up in the Museo de America or in the Royal Cabinet in Madrid. This is a photograph of the materials taken out in 1787, which is so important because this is the first real museum collection ever made in the Maya area, at least, and it's still there, all cataloged and everything. And this is a visit that Heinrich Schliemann, the famous excavator of Troy, he paid a visit there in 1882 and asked to sit with the Palenque material. On the right in the silk hat is Juan de Dios de la Rada y Delgado, who was head of the museum. And that's Schliemann there on the left. this guy here. We don't know who these people are. But these are hieroglyphic panels from under the palace, part of a stucco bas-relief, and some other artifacts and things that were found at the site in 1787. Little book came out in London. Somebody got a hold of some drawings that had been made during that expedition, and they decided it was worthwhile to publish. So with this ringing title of The Description of the Ruins of an Ancient City, discovered in Guatemala in Spanish America, because it was then part of Guatemala, they published a book, and in it were drawings. Some of the bas-reliefs. The people at the time, the artists that went in there in the 1780s, they didn't feel like drawing hundreds of glyphs. So when they'd see a hieroglyphic panel with maybe 200 hieroglyphs, they thought, well, nobody's really going to check us out. So they'd maybe draw 6 big ones and fill the space. So that's what they did. And this is one of the drawings, but this was published. And this is these glyphs would drive people crazy. No matter that they were poorly copied, and it's only about 10 out of the 16 or so in that column, we know now. But these were published, and this was the first thing to ever reach print on a Maya ruin. This guy saw it. This is Constantine Samuel Rafinesque Smaltz. He was born about the time Calderon went to Palenque, and he died about 1848 or 1843 somewhere. Anyway, he was a naturalist. Audubon wrote about him. A chapter in Audubon's ornithological biography is titled The Eccentric Naturalist, and that's this guy. This guy was a house guest of Audubon's at the time Audubon met him in the 1830s. And Audubon woke one night and heard a great noise in the bedroom upstairs where Rafinesque was staying. And he went up there, and Rafinesque had no clothes on, was running around the room with Audubon's favorite violin, trying to kill a bat. And he killed the bat, and he broke the violin to smithereens. And Audubon sort of kicked him out, never wrote much about him after that. But Rafinesque was a remarkable character. He was eccentric, true. He read everything. He claimed to have spoken 50 languages. He was born in Constantinople and died in Philadelphia. But in between, he wrote books on medical botany and banking. He wrote poems about the lost tribes of Israel. And he became interested in hieroglyphs, particularly since Champollion was working with the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So he began writing a series of letters based on the hieroglyphs of Palenque, particularly that column of glyphs that we saw from the Temple of the Cross. And these were published in Baltimore in 1829. Rafinesque collaborated with the harbor master up there who was interested in American Indians, and they published this thing. And Rafinesque had written a bunch of letters to the Saturday Evening Post with all of his conclusions about hieroglyphs, and most of them were nonsense because, he had nothing to work with. But he did figure out that the bars were 5s and the dots were 1s, so he did figure out the number system, the way of writing numbers down so that, there's a 3, and there's a 10, and there's a 6, etc. Anyway, things sort of stood there for a long time. The guy that did the engravings for that book in 1822 was a madman, sort of. He was Jean-Frédéric Maximilien de Waldeck, a self-styled count who at the age of 56 got a job with a printing house in London and did the engravings for that book. But he was so enthralled by what he saw that he moved to Palenque in 1832 and started drawing the ruins. He did a wonderful job. All of his drawings, or most of them at least, are in the Newberry Library in Chicago. And these are the piers, the bas-reliefs on the areas between the doorways at Palenque that he did in the 1830s. He gets a lot of bad press because people claim that he put elephant trunks on a lot of his glyphs, but that was really in the published works, and that was the work of the engraver, not him. He did a fair job of drawing this thing that Calderon had seen. Pretty nice. And he drew all the glyphs, which was really remarkable. And he messed around a lot. He He moved in with a local Palenque woman, had a house built at the foot of the Temple of the Cross, and to illustrate his books there, his inscriptions of the Subterraneos and the aqueduct at Palenque and everything, he would do these drawings of his friends in Palenque. All this got so much publicity that two other people were reading about it, and that was John Lloyd Stephens, who was a New York lawyer, and his friend Frederick Catherwood, who was an architect. And they kept reading about this stuff. They read the 1822 report, and they read the accounts of the Depay, they read Humboldt, all these things. And it was talking about these ruins of Otalum or Palenque. So they decided to go down there. And so they went. They got appointed by President Van Buren as a diplomatic team. And they were chosen to go down and find the government of Central America because it was in revolution. And they went. And then as soon as they got there, they took off their epaulets and everything and got down to the real work they had come to do, which was drawing all the ruins. And they journeyed all over the place, published an incredible amount of drawings and text, wonderful reads. Every year I read Stephens. And Catherwood did the drawings. This is his version of Palenque, clearly done from memory because he was really ill during the trip. But he stuck it out and really did a good job. And Harper and Brothers sold 11 editions of this stuff in 1841 and again in 1843. So these were bestsellers. They went all over the world. They were translated into German and French, etc. And they got picked up in installments in magazines like this one in London. And the Saturday Magazine, there's the palace again at Palenque. None of this escaped the attention of P.T. Barnum, who ran a big show up in New York in Albany. And he decided he would take advantage of this sudden interest in Palenque. And so he hired two Salvadorian children, Maxima and Bartolo. And he proclaimed them to be Aztec Lilliputians from the lost Maya city of Ishimaya. And these children were taken literally around the European circuit. They met Queen Victoria. This was the pamphlet that came out showing the Temple of the Sun panel there at Palenque at the top. And but Barnum, made a lot of money off this. And this really just increased the public knowledge of Palenque. Then a whole series of visitors, the most important of which was Alfred Percival Maudsley, who came through the area in the 1880s and 90s and took photographs, had all the sites cleared, and made incredible drawings and photographs. His artist, Annie Hunter, in London, made incredibly accurate drawings of the inscriptions and things at Palenque. So we finally get the stuff done right. Catherwood came close. Archaeology came to Palenque in 1934. I guess really the first time anybody went on there with serious-minded was 85 years ago, December the 14th, 1922, when Franz Blom was hired by the Mexican government, or at least the archaeological establishment, to go see what he could suggest about doing about these ruins. So he sort of walked around, cleared it, and mapped it, and did some things, and suggested a program of excavation. Then in 1934, when Mexico formed its National Institute of Anthropology and History, they sent Miguel Angel Fernandez there to start digging the palace. And he did. They looked around and they found in this little courtyard, they found Palenque's bathrooms, a real system of bathrooms and drainage and sewage and everything. The palace, it's the only example we have from the entire Maya area yet. Anyway, they noticed these ruins and they found this hallway with an oval tablet on it, which was pretty incredible. And then they found a slab of stone in here. There's the oval tablet that had been drawn in 1787. The throne was gone. This is the throne leg that was sent to Madrid, and this is in fragments now in the warehouse at Palenque, but it's not in the original building. When they finished the palace, they started looking over at the Temple of the Inscriptions. This is how it was in 1942 and 1948 when Alberto Rus was hired to start. And he walked in the temple up there and he noticed something that Stephens hadn't seen or Catherwood or anybody. And that is that the floor of the temple was made out of big stone slabs with holes in them. At Del Rio in 1787, it sort of cracked a couple of them. So Alberto had the workers pull up the stone, and underneath the stone there was 2 steps leading down. Well, you know how budgets are in archaeology. He didn't know whether it went down 4 more feet and stopped, or whether there were 3 steps. So he decided to go for it. This was in 1948. At the end of the summer of 48, he'd gone down 23 steps. 1949, he went down about 23 steps again. 1950, 51, 52. Finally, in June of 1952, he walked into this empty room at the bottom, and there was nothing there. But he had a group of Maya with him, stonemasons from Oshkutskab, Yucatan, and a group of local Palencanos. And Juan Chablé, who was one of the masons, the head mason, said, Don Alberto, there's a funny-looking little triangular stone over there against the wall. If we could move that, I'll bet you there's something behind it. And Alberto said, can't lose, let's try. We've done this, we've gone down the steps, there were skeletons and rubble and pottery and caches and everything. And so there must be something down here. So they moved the triangular stone aside, but then they opened the slab, and there was a room with a stone in it. And he thought, He was with Cesar Saenz, another archaeologist, and Alberto told me later that, he thought it was a altar, a table. He didn't know what it was. Nobody had ever found anything like that. And then he came back, and Juan Chablé, the mason, said, hey, Don Alberto, why don't you drill a hole in the side of this thing and see if it's hollow? He did, and it was. We went into town and got 15 automobile jacks and pulled the thing up, and there was a body inside. And so what I'm going to do is let David take the story here for a while and talk about the man in the tomb.
Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at a lot of detail at what turned out to be, I guess, the American equivalent, if there is one, to King Tut's tomb. I mean, it's the most famous ancient royal burial in all of the Americas, arguably. The man inside. Of course, the identity of this person, Roos wasn't aware of in 1952. In fact, his name wasn't really fully deciphered until, about 15 years ago. But a bit before that, people knew part of his name, and he's usually simply just called Pakal. And Pakal is right over there on the other side of the stage, looking out. I was thinking if there was an empty seat, he might like to maybe look on at the screen, but we'll see an image of that head in a little bit. His full name was Kinich Hanab Pakal, and he was the greatest king of Palenque, one of the greatest of all Maya kings. Now, you've seen an image of this oval tablet. This is the carving that is set into the back wall of one of the structures in the palace. And the image of on the back wall was, we think, the earliest portrait of Pakal. So here he is on the throne, seated, and his mother is presenting him with this royal headdress, the military headdress, a symbol of his kind of duty as king to wage war. Now, Pakal was born in the year 603 AD. We know from the inscriptions. He came to power in 615. So he was 12 years old when he became king. What's interesting about Pakal, however, is that the first records we have of him, probably including also this this panel, are much later, and probably date to the 640s, 650s AD. So he was actually reigning for quite a long time before he really left his mark or began to leave his mark in the palace. Most of the palace was, except for the tower and a few other structures, was actually built by him in the mid-7th century, including the building that held the throne. His mother was very important. Her name was Lady Sakuk, or Lady White Quetzal. And she passed away not long, actually, before he goes on this really ambitious program of building and carving inscriptions and so forth. You know, when you come to power when you're 12 years old, I think your mother probably is wielding a lot of the power behind the throne. And I think, you know, the reading between the lines, I think maybe she had to kind of pass away before he really became comfortable as king and really decided to take off, so to speak. The other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, Palenque had suffered quite a bit politically around the year 599, 600, when it was conquered by the great city of Calakmul. And so when Pakal was born, I think Palenque was really in a very problematic period of its history. So it took many decades, I think, for Palenque and Pakal as a great king to reassert Palenque as a important royal court. This is one reason why he is so important. He was really venerated by later kings as his descendants as a great historical figure that really brought Palenque back from the brink. And here he is. We can recognize him simply by his face. Palenque art is so realistic and portraiture is so sensitive that when a sculpture, a relief such as this is found, we know exactly who this is, even if we didn't have his name glyph, but we do in this case. This is Pakal as a older man, probably later in his life, as opposed to that early portrait we just saw. And the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Roos was excavating, is really Pakal's temple. That is why it's near the palace, and that's why it's really looming over, literally, the space, the center of the site. The upper temple here is decorated still on the exterior with these plaster decorations, and they're a bit hard to see these days, but you can see the steps here leading into the central doorway, and you can see there are these standing figures portrayed on the outer piers. These were actually drawn in some of those early architectural renderings. These are, I believe, the father and the mother of Pakal, and also two of his ancestors on the outer doorways. So as you walk into the Temple of the Inscriptions, into his funerary building, you're greeted by, you know, these ancestral, these predecessors of Pakal who are there to greet you. And so you're walking into this inner sanctum, which is really all about his place in the history of Palenque, his importance. And as you walk in between those pillars, you see the beautiful preservation of the temple. This is really not restored. This is as it looked to the first explorers and as it looks today. And it's really interesting to read what they're talking about in these inscriptions. This is the back panel. A modern drawing. This is Linda Shealy's drawing of the glyphs. There's a lot of this that's really opaque and really hard for us to understand. But we get a sense of, you know, this long narrative about Pakal and his long reign and all of the things he did, venerating the gods and keeping the cosmos going. But they're characterizing this beginning point of his reign where you know, he is building the palace, and he's reconquering lands that Palenque had lost previously. But they're couching this history in very esoteric religious terminology, and I want to share a little bit of this with you. There's one passage here where they're talking about the 11th Katun, right? This is in the mid-7th century. And not many Maya inscriptions are translated in books for you to go read and ponder. You know, this is really esoteric stuff. But I made a stab at actually translating this passage for you to see if you could sort of get a sense of what they're saying. And this is more or less, I think, what they're talking about. And I'll explain what this means. 12 Ahau 8 Kech, that's the date, is the 11th Katun. That's pretty easy. He rules the shiny sky maze. That's the god of the number 12 because it's 12 Ahau. And on that day or in this time period, this 20-year period, they're characterizing this chunk of time in a sense. The shiny jewel tree sprouts and some other cosmic tree sprouts. It's the heavenly load, it's the earthly load. That means a load of riches like jade. Jade collars, jade ear ornaments are bestowed upon the 9 sky supports of the sun, the 16 supports of the sun, the dynastic lords. Well, what in the world is this all about? What they're saying is that in this, when Pakal is really powerful, when Palenque is receiving tribute from its vanquished subordinates, when jade literally is pouring into the court, into the palace through tribute, that the tree of jade is sprouting, right? Riches are just pouring all over Palenque, and the gods are pleased. The cosmos is pleased, and the dynastic lords are being, dressed and adorned with all of this finery. So it's a very specific kind of language, which really just describing the good times of Palenque, as opposed to earlier times that are characterized very differently in this narrative. So Pakal's reign is all about richness. It's all about really economic boom times. And this is what Rus saw in 1952, right? Now, this is a sarcophagus, and the symbolism of it is really quite extraordinary, and I'll spend a bit of time. I could go on for hours, but I won't. And the sides of the sarcophagus were carved in these extraordinary images of ancestors, of the royal house of Palenque, all of Pakal's predecessors. But they're not just portraits, they're kind of strange in a way, because they're plant people. The ancestors of Pakal, including here his mother and his father, are shown as fruiting trees that burst up out of the ground. Lady White Quetzal, his mother, on the left, is shown as a cacao tree. You see the cacao pods. His father is shown as another kind of, it looks like grapes there, but it's not. It's some other kind of fruiting tree. And the ancestors all around the sarcophagus are shown with different kinds of food plants. And this idea of sustenance and the continuity of life and ancestral rebirth, these are all themes that are extremely important in this tomb. This is an early photograph of Pakal himself in his tomb after the inner slab was lifted. This is one piece of stone, all carved out. Certainly well preserved in some ways, but his skull was very badly damaged. We'll see a good example, a good photograph of that soon. But he was covered in jade, as a good Maya king would be. Jade collar, jade bracelets, and an extraordinary mask as well. Here is Pakal. This was a photograph taken in 1952 by the physical anthropologist who was working with the skeleton. Only some of them have recently been published, but most of them remain unpublished. Extraordinary photographs. What you're seeing here, of course, is some of the jade and the mask. Do you see how it's slumped over to one side off of his skull? But you can see part of it's still articulated, right? In fact, the eye is right here, and some of the mosaic work is still together. Well, this was reconstructed and actually just recently reanalyzed and re-put back together by Laura Filoy in Mexico City. And this is the Jade Mask. Unbelievable. It's a life mask, again, of him. You can recognize him, not only in the 2D portraits, but in the three-dimensional portraits as well. The ear ornaments that were slumped, next to him there were not on him, they were on the Jade Mask. It's a mask of life, right? Jade, the color green, that precious material. It's the color of fresh corn. All of these symbols were very important to the Maya. In the mouth, you see that kind of T-shaped piece of jade, which one might say as well that maybe is the filed tooth of the king, but if you look at his teeth, they don't look like that. That's actually the symbol of breath, of the spirit of life that's emerging out of his mouth. It's almost like a hieroglyph shown in 3 dimensions. And of course, the very famous lid. I think we all have seen images of this, right? The extraordinary carving on the very top, which has been debated and talked about ad nauseum. But there's a lot of new stuff we can say about it. It used to be thought that this was an image of Pakal, and sure enough, he's recognizable there, right? Falling into the underworld. Well, that's absolutely wrong. He's not falling into the underworld. He is rising in the east as the newborn sun, as the newborn maize god. And you're seeing him in this really strange pose right here, as an infant, kind of reclining on his back. And out of the jaws of the underworld emerges the eastern sun, and he's kind of riding along with it. And behind him is a tree covered in jade. This is the sprouting tree, right? The sprouting jeweled tree that's talked about in the tablet up above. Here he is. Again, that face, it's so recognizable. His son, Kinich Khan Bahlam, came to power when he died, when Pakal died at 80, and became a very important king himself. We can, again, recognize him by his portrait. He always has that kind of big lower lip. And Khan Bahlam is the one who, in 690, dedicates the temple inscriptions. He finishes the architectural program that Pakal began and dedicates the temple to his father. And then very quickly decides to leave his own mark. I think Khan Bahlam must have been a bit chagrined in a sense. I don't know if he was, maybe feel like he had to live up to this reputation of his father. I mean, how do you outdo Pakal? Well, he almost did. Maybe in fact he did, or did something parallel to Pakal by creating a set of temples nearby across the river, the Group of the Cross. It was Pakal's son who designed these. Again, for a great Katun ending, 913,000 in the Maya calendar. And these were amazing buildings. There's no other set of pyramids that are quite like these, all dedicated to the 3 members of the patron gods, the set of gods of Palenque, the so-called Palenque Triad. And they all have cosmic meaning. The buildings here are all oriented towards the sacred spring of the Otolum River, which gushes out of the mountainside. Very sacred spot here, these springs. And so here are the 3 temples of the Group of the Cross. The grandsons dedicate a temple in the same area of the Group of the Cross. And here they are. This is Kinich Akal Monab and his younger brother over here. And when they dedicate the temple, what do they show? Who do they show in the center of the composition? Pakal. Because he is the greatest king in the history of this court. He is the one person who they can hearken back to really establish their pedigree and their position in the court of Palenque. And he is the active central figure in this composition. Years and years after he's dead, Pakal is still at the center of everything. And this is why I think Palenque, most of what we see of Palenque in that central area is Pakal's city. It always was, even to the kings who came much later. Okay, so